Fantasy is one of my favourite genres to read, and I'm often asked by people, what is a good way to get into fantasy? What are your favourite fantasy books? Or where should I start if I want to get started in reading fantasy books? And today I am here to tell you exactly that, because this is such a good genre to get into, and I think some people can be slightly intimidated when they don't know anything about reading fantasy. So today, this is your introduction to fantasy books. I'm going to go through a few different categories of fantasy books, the most popular in my opinion, and the way that I kind of see them in my head and divide them up. I'm going to tell you exactly what each of these categories of fantasy books means, and I'm also going to give you recommendations for each of the different categories of books I think you should start with, and also just my favourite books in that specific subgenre. Just before we start though, please subscribe if you haven't already, and if you have subscribed then thank you so much and welcome back. So let's get started, and the way I want to start this, if you are a brand new person trying to get into fantasy, I want to try and figure out your tolerance for the fantastical, because this genre is not for everyone. Lots of people don't actually like reading fantasy because if they can't picture it happening in the real world, then they don't like reading it, and it just won't make any sense to them. So the way I'm going to do this video is I'm going to start with the very light fantasy, and then we're going to get all the way into the real deep epic high fantasy stuff. So to start off, let's talk about magical realism. This might be a genre that you're already really familiar with. It's very popular in Latin American literature. In magical realism books, they are set within our world as we know it, and the magical elements are either not really explicitly commented on, or they are highly localized, maybe just within one family or one location. This is a great way to dip your toe into the fantasy genre and see if you do like these more fantastical elements, but the books themselves are really not focused too much on that magical fantastical element. Some books that fit into this category are House of Spirits by Isabel Allende, Love in the Time of Cholera by Gabriel Garcia Marquez. Also, actually most of his books fit into this genre, but also some of Neil Gaiman's books like The Ocean at the End of the Lane, and also the hugely popular series Before the Coffee Gets Cold. They are all within the magical realism genre. So that's kind of a good way to gauge how you feel about the fantastical elements. If you feel good about that and you want a little bit more fantasy, then we can move on to talking about speculative fiction. So technically, the definition for speculative fiction is a genre of fiction that encompasses works in which the setting is other than the real world, involving supernatural, futuristic, or other imagined elements. So as you can see, the technical definition for speculative fiction is actually very broad, and it's kind of an umbrella term for all types of fantastical elements in any story. So technically all fantasy would be speculative fiction, but that's not quite how it's actually used. If you went and recommended someone or asked for a recommendation for a speculative fiction book, you're very unlikely to get something like The Lord of the Rings, which would be kind of a high epic fantasy. So although it technically encompasses all of fantasy, including sci-fi and horror, and also some mystery would be probably put into speculative fiction, it's not really used that way, and I don't use it that way. I would use it more as a subgenre. And in my mind, speculative fiction is more for fantasy, but as people who really like literary fiction. So a lot of speculative fiction is still very character-based, kind of like a literary fiction book, but it more focuses on the what if. But usually they're much lower on the intensive world building as some of the other genres of fantasy. For example, lots of the classic dystopian books really fit well within speculative fiction, like 1984 and Fahrenheit 451, Brave New World, and The Handmaid's Tale. I would say that they all fit within speculative fiction. But if we're talking about my favourites for this genre, then I have two authors that I think you should definitely check out. Firstly, I want to recommend Kazuo Ishiguro, and he is one of my favourite authors, and he doesn't only do speculative fiction, but three of his most famous books are definitely speculative fiction. Those being Clara and the Sun, Never Let Me Go, and my personal favourite out of the three, The Buried Giant. This one I think would be a great start if you want to get into speculative fiction. This is a beautiful and haunting story about a couple who go off into a land of mist and rain, trying to find a son that they haven't seen for years. The other recommendation I have for you is Ursula K. Le Guin. She writes speculative fiction and also high fantasy as well, but she is just such a fantastic author, and I think that if you read primarily literary fiction, I think that you could really get along with her writing, and especially this book, The Left Hand of Darkness. Okay, so let's move now into a slightly more fantastical element, which is contemporary fantasy. So this is exactly as it sounds. It's fantasy, but it's set within in our world and our time. This is also quite a common genre for young adult and also children's books. So think of Twilight, The Mortal Instruments, Percy Jackson, Harry Potter. Also, there's lots of adult contemporary fantasy like Neil Gaiman's American Gods. I think Neil Gaiman writes in almost every single sub-genre that we're going to be talking about today. One of my favourite recent contemporary fantasy series is Legendborn, which is an Arthurian legend retelling set in modern day America. Okay, so let's now move on to the juiciest category. This is high fantasy. This is probably what you're thinking about when someone is telling you that they're reading a fantasy book. High fantasy focuses on a world completely different to our own. There's different politics, religion, species, geography, everything is completely different. And this is why it really focuses a lot on the world building. So within this category, I want to talk about two different subdivisions depending on what you might prefer. So I'm splitting these into cozy high fantasy and epic high fantasy. So let's start with cozy. So cozy fantasy has had a huge surge in popularity in the last couple of years. But because this is a newer genre, there's a few different ways that you could define cozy fantasy. But often they have similar elements of a really comforting or healing story. They have slice of life moments, and they're often more gentle and cozy in their storytelling. Some people define these as low stakes or low trigger stories. I personally think it's more about the feeling that the story will give you. For example, I'd personally categorize something like Nettle and Bone as cozy fantasy, despite it having some horror elements. Lots of cozy fantasy would have romance, but more as a subplot than a main story. And also I found that lots of it focuses either on a witchy vibe or more fae-centered stories. So if this subgenre sounds like somewhere you want to start, then I have 3 recommendations. The first being Half a Soul by Olivia Atwater. This is about a girl who was cursed by a fairy when she was young to only have half of a soul. This is high fantasy because it has fae and other worlds, but it's also historical fantasy, so you can kind of see how some of these genres kind of blend together. I just absolutely love this one. It's cozy and it's whimsical, and it has really witty dialogue between the main characters. So that is one of my recommendations. The next recommendation I've already mentioned, and it is Nettle and Bone. This is kind of a take on the traditional quest story, but it's about a woman who's lived most of her life as a nun and then decides that she has to go and save her sister from an evil prince. And she kind of picks up these different characters along the way, including a chicken who's possessed by a demon. I just love the fairy tale vibes, and it was also very gothic and lent into the horror element sometimes. It's also very funny and unexpected and just very, very unique. And then my third recommendation is Legends and Lattes. I do have a slight caveat with this one because I'm recommending it because it's a very, very popular cozy fantasy story and I can see why people would like it. It's just not one of my personal favourites of the genre, but I do think that is just personal preference because I usually prefer stories to have a little bit higher stakes or a little bit more going on in the plot, whereas this is a very cozy and very sweet story that mainly just focuses on our main character Viv. So Viv is a battle-weary orc. She wants to give up her life of battles and bloodshed and open up a coffee shop, which is exactly what she does, and this just follows her adventure in setting up a coffee shop. And if you think cozy fantasy is going to be your new favourite genre, then I would really recommend that you start here. But now we are getting to my personal favourite subgenre out of all of the types of fantasy there is, which is epic fantasy. So this is one of my favourite types of fantasy story to read, but it's also the most intensive. So this will be the least friendly to any beginner who's never read any fantasy before, but it doesn't mean that you won't like it. So epic fantasy are usually these long running series, and they are high fantasy, so they'll have a huge focus on the world building. They'll have much more complex world building, such as politics and war and religion, and usually there's a much wider cast of characters as well, and you have multiple characters that you read from within the story, so it's a multi-POV type story. They usually span either a huge period of time or they have lots of different geographical locations as well. One of the most well-known epic fantasies is Lord of the Rings, and I'm not going to recommend it to you because I feel like if you've already know this genre, then you already know all about the Lord of the Rings and you'll know if you like it or you won't. But I will briefly mention 3 of my favourite epic fantasies. Number 1 being one that I talk about all the time, which is The Stormlight Archive by Brandon Sanderson. This is eventually going to be a 10-book series, and each book is well over 1,000 pages. It's also almost impossible to sum up these stories because you're following so many different characters and it's an entirely new world. But basically, it's set in a world that is currently at war, and it's also ravaged by these storms that happen. You follow a few different characters, a scholar, you follow a slave, you follow the general of the army. And just one of my favourite things about this series and this kind of genre in general is how slowly all the pieces build up to create this absolutely immersive reading experience. Specifically with Brandon Sanderson, I would say his plotting is always immaculate. They are an adventure from page one, and the endings of his book are some of the best action sequences that I've ever read in a book. Another one that is very, very well known, but I do want to mention it because it's also one of my favourites, and it is the Game of Thrones. So the Song of Ice and Fire books are epic high fantasy, and I would say compared to Stormlight Archive, these really much more focus on the politics and the political maneuverings of the characters. I'm not going to bother summarising these books because I feel like there's no point and you'll have heard of them already. And my final recommendation in this category is The Name of the Wind. So this is the Kingkiller Chronicles, and I have to strongly caveat that this is currently an unfinished series that is unlikely to probably ever be finished. But does that stop me recommending it? No, because I absolutely adore both of these books. If maybe you've tried Brandon Sanderson's writing or even George R.R. Martin's writing and you didn't really get along with it, but you still want to try a different type of epic fantasy, then I would really, really recommend you pick up Name of the Wind, because the writing in this is its highest and strongest point, I think. These books are a story within a story where you are hearing about the life and the adventures of one man who grows up to be a notorious wizard. Part of the magic in this world is to do with words, so words are used incredibly carefully and very intricately in this book, and it's one of my favourite things about it. So that is my third recommendation for epic fantasy. So you might be thinking at this point, I've read some fantasy books and they don't fit in any of these categories yet. Well, next category that I want to talk about is romantic fantasy / romantasy. So this I think probably needs a whole separate video because it's a huge genre within itself, and even the split between romantic fantasy and romantasy is something that is hotly debated. But in general, these are fantasy stories that really focus on the love story and the romantic plot. And these romances, just like non-fantasy romances, can range all the way from fade to black or closed door romantic books to very explicit smut books. For example, all of the ones that would fit into this category are most of Sarah J Maas's books, From Blood and Ash, Fourth Wing. But my recommendations for romantic fantasy, I have two main recommendations. One being Fortuna Sworn, which is a series. This focuses on Fortuna, who is a nightmare, meaning anytime she's close to someone, she can make them see their worst nightmares, and her brother goes missing, so she is on a mission to find him, and she has to go into the dark Fey underworld, and it's so much fun. It's a real slow burn romance, and I just absolutely love it. I think it's really unique. And then my other recommendation is actually a graphic novel, but it's one of my favourite romantic fantasies, and it is Lore Olympus. So this is a Hades and Persephone retelling, and like I said, it's a graphic novel. They are really bingeable. They are so much fun. I love the depiction of all of the gods, and it's kind of set in modern day, even though it is a high fantasy. But I just really love how it was adapted, and it's such a fun one. I think I read the first two books in like a couple of hours in one day, and I've just been addicted ever since. I absolutely love these books. Okay, so I have one last category that I briefly want to mention, and that is sci-fi. So obviously we are actually talking about fantasy today, but as you can see, already talking about these different sub-genres, there is such a blend between all of the different books, and they can contain all different elements involved. So I do want to briefly mention sci-fi because they are often pushed together with fantasy books, and also some books are really both sci-fi and fantasy. And some of my favourite books that are a blend of sci-fi and fantasy would be the Broken Earth trilogy by N.K. Jemisin, which is set in a world where there are these colossal extinction level events often that happen, and society has to build itself up back again from scratch. The Broken Earth books are just absolutely amazing and so well written. Another one is Red Rising. Okay, sorry, we got interrupted and we're also losing the light. I need to wrap this video up. I'm now out of breath because I just had to run downstairs. Okay, so where was I talking? I was talking about Red Rising. So Red Rising is technically a sci-fi, but it's also dystopian, and it has fantasy elements. It is set in a really far-flung future on Mars, and it also takes a lot of inspiration from the Roman Empire. And finally, just 2 more shout-outs for my favorite ever sci-fi book, a classic of the genre and one of the funniest books that I've ever read is The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. I just love all of these books so much. And then a more modern sci-fi that I've been absolutely obsessed with is Gideon the Ninth, which is part of the Locked Tomb series, and I've read the second one in this series now, and it's just as good. I'm absolutely obsessed. And the tagline for this series is lesbian necromancers in space. Okay, so that is my breakdown of fantasy books and where to start, and all of the different types of subgenres within the fantasy realm. I could definitely do a part 2 where I go deeper into these genres and talk about some other things that came up while I was planning for this video, but I really hope you enjoyed it. Please subscribe if you did, it would mean a lot to me, and please let me know if this video has helped you at all, and also which type of subgenre you're most interested in or what you usually read from. And also please tell me if there's subgenres that I've missed that I do not read from and therefore don't know enough about. I would be very, very interested to know. I'm going to leave it there because it is now fully getting dark. So please remember to subscribe, comment below, and I'll talk to you again soon. Bye.